What kind of war needs airports you can't see from the sky? Not hidden planes, hidden runways. Runways buried in forests, hangars sealed inside hills, airports that didn't exist on maps, but launched jets into the open sky and disappeared again like ghosts. As the Allied bombs rained from above, Nazi engineers didn't build wider, they went deeper. Tunnels, lifts, elevators that swallowed entire aircraft. You couldn't bomb what you couldn't see, but why build a war beneath the earth? Why carve cathedrals of concrete no one would live to explain? Were they just hiding or preparing for something else entirely? Hello, world history lovers. Tonight, we drift into the unheard side of global conflict, one rarely found in textbooks but still sleeping beneath European soil. Welcome to this quiet descent into the topic. Why did the Nazis keep building underground airports? Where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments. It's always amazing to see how far these stories reach. And if you find calm in the slow unraveling of dark history, you know what to do. Subscribe this channel. Now, get comfortable. Let's go deeper. As the Allied bombing campaign intensified in 1943, the German war machine began adapting not with more force, but more silence. They didn't build higher walls, they built thicker ceilings, not stronger fences, Bonnekonso, and nie. Quatters, Kur, Malideracher, Senbacher, the Reich's engineers turned their gaze inward, beneath cities, inside cliffs, under forests, to create infrastructure that couldn't be traced by air, not just bunkers or shelters, but entire facilities, refueling stations, maintenance depots, and, most mysteriously, runways and hangars embedded in terrain. Imagine an airfield that looks like a stretch of grass from above, but lifts away to reveal elevators swallowing whole aircraft. This wasn't military science fiction. It was happening fast across occupied Europe. Allied air superiority meant one thing: every visible asset would burn. So the Nazis removed visibility from the equation. The strategy shifted: protect the plane before it even launches. Hide the launch, hide the fuel, hide the command, hide the war itself. But as blueprints surfaced and bombed-out entrances were discovered decades later, a darker question emerged. Were these underground airports just tactical, or were they signs of a regime preparing for a permanent life beneath the surface? A fallback civilization, a bunker state. These were not modest shelters. They were cathedrals of war, precision-built, obsessively engineered, and in many cases, never finished. But in those foundations, abandoned or destroyed, lies one of the most disturbing architectural legacies of World War II. Not just how to fight a war underground, but how to survive one. It didn't happen all at once. The turn toward the underground wasn't a single decision, but a creeping reaction, a response to growing fear, escalating pressure, and the sheer weight of Allied air power that began rewriting the rules of warfare in the early 1940s. By the time British and American bombers were darkening the skies over Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, and Berlin, the surface of Nazi Germany was becoming uninhabitable, not just for civilians, but for the very infrastructure of war itself. It was no longer a question of whether something could be hidden above ground, but how long it could survive before being obliterated. Entire cities were reduced to ash in a matter of nights. Aircraft factories were flattened, fuel depots were vaporized. The myth of German invincibility was breaking down, not in trenches or tank battles, but from 25,000 feet in the air. And as the flames rose higher, Nazi leadership realized that survival, if it was possible, wouldn't be found in firepower, but in shadow. The answer wasn't to build stronger buildings. It was to remove them from view entirely. And so, they went down. By mid-1943, the Reich's Architectural Brain Trust, men like Albert Speer and his network of engineers, began shifting strategy. This wasn't just about bunkers anymore. This was about total transference. Entire assembly lines, aviation hubs, and command centers would have to disappear from the sky. The surface was compromised, and that shift, from defending what could be seen to creating what couldn't, was the philosophical root of the Nazi underground airport campaign. It wasn't just a tactic. It became a belief system that the future of warfare wasn't in scale, but in invisibility, and that belief gave rise to one of the most ambitious subterranean engineering programs in modern history. One that started with paranoia but ended in complete architectural obsession. The first signs appeared in scattered reports. Allied photo analysts noticed train lines leading toward forested hills, then simply ending. No stations, no terminals, just a wall of trees. But intelligence officers on the ground knew better. What looked like woods were often disguises, entrances buried under brush, camouflaged access ramps, fake barns covering heavy lift platforms. What was being constructed underneath these quiet places? The answer was elusive, but the clues were mounting. In the Harz Mountains, villagers reported strange convoys delivering steel beams and massive crates into the side of a limestone cliff. At night, they said, low humming sounds echoed beneath the ground, generators possibly. Others claimed they saw flickers of welding torches behind boarded rock faces. The Allies began digging, not with shovels, but with surveillance, and what they found stunned them. Beneath those hills were concrete chambers the size of cathedrals. Some were over 100 meters long, with ceilings 15 meters high, more than enough room to house multiple fighter planes. These weren't shelters. These were hangars, not for storage, but for operation. Why go to such lengths? Because the Allies were winning the air. Between 1942 and 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces and the RAF flew over 1 million sorties into Axis territory. Germany's infrastructure was being erased faster than it could be replaced. In response, the Luftwaffe was being squeezed, not just tactically, but existentially. They couldn't launch what they couldn't protect, so the Nazis turned to the earth. Bomb-proof vaults were excavated beneath working farms. Runways were disguised as ordinary roads. New aircraft designs, especially the jet-powered Me-262, required secure launch conditions that simply didn't exist above ground anymore. And thus began a program of migration, the air war, moving into the bedrock itself. But this shift presented new problems. Building underground air bases wasn't just a question of hiding. It required completely new systems of life support. These weren't caves. They had to function like living machines. Ventilation was paramount. Jet fuel gives off heavy fumes. Without advanced airflow engineering, the spaces would be uninhabitable within minutes of ignition. So German engineers, with the help of forced labor from occupied nations and concentration camps, began installing massive filtration ducts. These ducts had to be protected too, hidden under layers of earth, stone, or fake buildings. Fuel reserves were buried in pressurized tanks. Munitions were loaded through side tunnels. In some cases, aircraft elevators were installed, hoisting Me-262s to the surface for launch and lowering them again before retaliatory bombers could arrive. This wasn't fantasy. This was happening. And fast. One such project near Landsberg am Lech became infamous, known only by internal code names like Weingut I and Diana II. It was a vast underground construction site where slave laborers worked under lethal conditions to build what was believed to be one of the largest aircraft facilities ever conceived below ground. The site was so massive it had its own rail yard, underground. Tunnels stretched for miles. Concrete arches were reinforced with steel so thick that Allied bombs barely left a scratch. But despite the effort, many of these projects were never completed. The war was moving too quickly, and Allied forces were closing in. Still, the attempt revealed just how far the Nazis were willing to go to bring the war underground, and how much they believed in a future where survival meant vanishing from the surface entirely. Even Hitler himself became personally obsessed with underground construction in the final years. His own command bunker, the Führerbunker in Berlin, became the blueprint for how command infrastructure could be moved into the earth. But while his personal retreat was small, the broader vision was much larger. Hitler had long believed that technology, not ideology, would ultimately deliver victory. If the surface could no longer be held, then Germany must learn to thrive without it. And from that philosophy emerged not just underground airports, but a whole theory of subterranean warfare. A world where airfields, factories, command centers, and even communities could operate unseen, underground not as retreat, but as dominion. The danger of these facilities wasn't just what they held, it was what they represented. A shift in the very nature of war, total war, permanent war, war without sky. These bases weren't just fallback plans. They were the seeds of a new kind of geography, a militarized underworld where conflict could continue regardless of who held the skies above. And that made them deeply threatening, even long after the war ended. Because once you move war beneath the surface, how do you know when it ends? How do you find what's been hidden so well it never wanted to be found? To understand how these underground airports became possible, you have to understand how the Nazi regime viewed land, not just as territory to control, but as a raw material to reshape. The Nazis didn't see forests, hills, or mountains as obstacles. They saw them as camouflage, as tools, as ready-made disguises for weapons, machinery, and entire military ecosystems. And at the core of this mindset was a disturbing blend of ideological obsession and ruthless practicality. In Hitler's Germany, nature was not sacred. It was to be used, bent, hollowed out, converted into war space. The forests of Bavaria, the caves of Austria, the rocky hills of Alsace, these places weren't preserved during the war. They were consumed by it. And nowhere was this more evident than in the construction of secret airfields embedded deep in terrain the Allies never thought to look twice at. Take, for example, Project Ringeltaube, wood pigeon. On the surface, it sounded like a pastoral reference, but in reality, it was one of several code names given to underground aviation facilities hidden beneath forest canopies. From the air, you saw trees, maybe some low buildings, a dirt road, but inside there were hangars that could store half a dozen jet fighters connected by tunnels to underground barracks and storage depots. Some had retractable roofs. Others were partially open with sloped terrain hiding the entrances from direct aerial view. In many cases, what looked like civilian farms were simply access points to military bases buried in nearby hills. These were not crude hideouts, they were highly engineered. Elevators, blast-proof doors, ventilation shafts hidden in tree stumps or artificial rocks. It was industrial camouflage taken to its most extreme conclusion. And the building didn't stop with one or two sites. As early as 1944, there were over 1,500 reported underground military installations spread across the Third Reich and occupied territories. Some were small, 1 or 2 rooms carved into a hill to hide an ammo truck, but others were sprawling compounds. And the most alarming part was that even today, the full extent of them is unknown. Many blueprints were destroyed. Others were never filed properly. Some locations were built so secretly that even local commanders didn't know what lay beneath their own feet. In the closing months of the war, as German forces retreated, hundreds of these entrances were destroyed, collapsed, or buried intentionally, their contents lost, their purpose never fully documented. And so modern historians and urban explorers are still uncovering forgotten sites in the woods of France, the mountains of Austria, and the countryside of Germany, places where slabs of concrete peek out of mossy hillsides, hinting at the dark infrastructure that once lived inside. Why go through all this trouble for airports when the war was clearly being lost? Because the Nazis weren't just thinking about the war they were fighting, they were imagining what might come next. These underground facilities weren't just meant to survive bombings. Some were built with post-war survivability in mind. If Berlin fell, if the cities were taken, if surface logistics collapsed, the Reich's most advanced technologies could be preserved underground. This meant not just aircraft, but experimental weapons, jet propulsion labs, radar development units, and even rumored prototypes of flying disc aircraft, many of which have fueled decades of conspiracy theories, but which likely stem from real fragments of hidden technology buried under mountains. The goal wasn't just defense, it was continuity, the ability to rebuild, relaunch, and resist, even after military defeat. These underground air bases were, in a way, time capsules, designed not for this battle, but the next one. And this next war, they believed, would be unlike anything fought before. One of the reasons so many of these airports were fitted for the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, was because it symbolized a shift in air power that the Nazis desperately hoped would reverse their losses. Jet speed meant they could outrun Allied bombers, attack in fast bursts, and disappear before enemy radar could lock on. But jets required specialized runways, advanced fuel storage, and protected maintenance bays. They couldn't just sit on open airstrips waiting to be strafed. They had to be protected, hidden, ready to emerge at the right moment, like a dagger from beneath a cloak. The underground airport became the perfect nesting ground for this new kind of bird. One built for velocity, not visibility, for power, not presence. But nothing about this was easy. The construction alone was staggering. These weren't smooth tunnels or symmetrical vaults. Much of the underground terrain was jagged, damp, and unstable. Workers, most of them enslaved, had to dig through solid limestone or reinforce loose soil with timber and steel under the constant threat of collapse. Accidents were common. Cave-ins killed hundreds. Poisonous gases from fuel and lack of ventilation led to sickness and death. At Mittelwerk, the underground factory that built V-2 rockets, the tunnels were so vast that workers lived inside them for weeks, sleeping in corners, eating near blast furnaces, and often dying with no one noticing until the stench revealed them. These facilities were not just wartime innovations. They were death machines in their own way, feeding on the lives of prisoners to produce weapons that might never even launch. And yet the scale kept growing. Why? Because the Nazi regime had crossed a psychological line. They no longer believed the surface belonged to them. The land above was lost. The sky was hostile. Only beneath the ground could the Reich continue to exist. Not as a state, but as a shell, a hive of venom buried in concrete. The underground airport was no longer just a place to launch planes. It became a metaphor, a belief that the war could go on, even if no one could see it, even if no one knew where it was being fought, or by whom. These hidden airports were preparing for a ghost war, one that could survive its own defeat. But of course, history had other plans. As Allied forces pushed further into Germany, many of these facilities were discovered in various stages of completion. Some were abandoned entirely, tunnels half dug, tracks laid but never used, lift shafts rusting in silence. Others were booby-trapped, set to detonate if entered. Still more were completely erased by retreating engineers determined to ensure their secrets stayed buried. To this day, Satellite imaging continues to uncover unusual terrain signatures in places once occupied by the Reich. Buried slabs, gridded shadows under hills, uneven forest growth where nothing should be growing. Each hint, each artifact, each opening sealed with stone tells us that there was more, much more. And that's what makes these places so chilling. Not what they launched, but what they almost became. Let's step back for a moment. Imagine you're a soldier in 1945, marching through the dark forests of southern Germany. The war is ending. The air smells like damp moss and diesel, and suddenly, you find something strange. A giant steel door hidden under a fake wooden shed. You open it. Inside, a tunnel big enough to fit a train. The walls are lined with wires, strange markings, crates sealed with the Nazi eagle, and a strange silence that feels colder than the air itself. You follow it deeper. You hear the wind hum through long corridors. The deeper you go, the more questions you ask. What was this place meant for? What did they think was coming next? That feeling of confusion, fear, and awe was exactly what many Allied soldiers felt in the final weeks of the war. Across Germany and occupied lands, they kept stumbling on hidden airfields that didn't look like airfields, places without runways, just a field or forest or hill, and underneath something massive. Whole underground airports built with reinforced concrete, elevators, fuel tanks, and aircraft parts scattered like bones. These weren't myths. They were real, and they were everywhere. One of the most famous examples was Project B8 Bergkristall in Austria, a huge underground facility hidden beneath the mountains near the town of St. Georgen an der Gusen. It was built to manufacture jet aircraft, especially the Me-262. It had wide tunnels, ventilation systems, and thick concrete walls that could resist bombing. But when Allied troops got there, it looked almost untouched. Some aircraft were half-assembled. Others were stored on underground tracks. The workers, mostly prisoners from the Mauthausen concentration camp, had been forced to dig the tunnels by hand, often with nothing but picks and shovels. Thousands died underground before a single jet ever flew. But why all this effort so late in the war? The Nazis weren't just planning for a counterattack. Some believed they were preparing for a world after defeat, a place where leaders, scientists, and weapons could disappear underground and wait for the world above to change, for a second chance. This is what made underground airports different from bunkers. A bunker was for hiding. An underground airport was for continuing the war, continuing experiments, continuing the idea of Nazi survival, even if Germany fell. And the idea wasn't new. In fact, Hitler himself was fascinated by underground spaces, not just for safety, but for symbolism. He believed real power should be invisible, hidden, protected. His own bunker in Berlin, where he spent his final days, was the beginning of that idea. But engineers around him took it further. What if entire industries could move underground? What if war could keep going even when the sky was lost? They imagined a kind of invisible empire, silent, dark, deep beneath the earth, waiting to return. That's why, in places like Kalle, Nordhausen, and Landsberg, huge amounts of money and manpower were thrown into building underground hangars and factories. These weren't just projects. They were last hopes, desperate attempts to cheat defeat. As one SS officer reportedly said, "If they take the skies from us, we'll take the ground from them." And for a while, it worked. Allied planes couldn't find what they couldn't see. Bombing raids missed targets hidden under hills. Fuel depots kept functioning. Repairs continued. Jets launched from wooded paths and vanished back into rock. It was a ghost war, planes appearing and disappearing without trace. But the cost was enormous, not just in money, but in human life. The labor used to build these places came mostly from concentration camps. Prisoners worked in freezing temperatures with little food, digging tunnels for 12 to 16 hours a day. If they slowed down, they were beaten. If they collapsed, they were replaced. Many of these men and women died before the walls were even completed. It was slavery, brutality, and death, all to build something that in many cases was never even used. That's the horror of these underground airports. They were never just about planes. They were about ideology and how far the regime would go to protect it. Even more disturbing, some of these hidden sites weren't only for jets. Reports from post-war investigators revealed experimental sections, rooms with heavy shielding, unknown equipment, strange wiring. Some believe these were used for early rocket tests or nuclear research. Others were sealed completely, entrances collapsed, files destroyed, and to this day, we don't know what was inside them. Some of the secrets remain buried, both literally and historically. After the war, many of these places were looted, sealed off, or repurposed. In East Germany and Soviet zones, the underground airports were sometimes reused as Cold War military installations. Others were flooded or caved in. Some became farms, warehouses, or tourist attractions, but some just vanished, forgotten in the woods, remembered only by those who built them or found them too late. And those silent entrances still remain today, hiding in the trees, covered by vines, waiting. What's striking is how few people today realize how deep this underground world went. We often picture World War II as a surface war, soldiers, tanks, cities, but there was another layer beneath, a secret layer of stone and steel, a network of tunnels and airfields that the world didn't know existed, built not just to survive bombs, but to survive history itself. And so, when we ask, why did the Nazis build underground airports? The answer isn't just tactical, it's psychological. It was about fear, about pride, about preparing for a future where their empire might have to live in shadows, where planes would rise from the ground like ghosts and disappear again before the world knew they were there. It was about refusing to die, even when the war was already lost. If you had stood near one of these hidden airfields in the final months of the war, somewhere deep in a Bavarian forest or along the Austrian mountains, you might not have noticed anything strange at first. Just a few trees, maybe a dirt road, perhaps an old farmhouse. But if you looked closer, the clues were everywhere. The trees weren't all real. Some were hollow, made of steel and painted to blend in. The road was wider than normal and perfectly flat because it was actually a disguised runway. The farmhouse? Just a shell built to cover a heavy blast-proof elevator that led into the rock below. And what lay beneath? A hangar carved straight into the mountain with space for 6 to 10 jet fighters, a fuel bay, sleeping quarters for mechanics, tool rooms, and air shafts rising silently through the hill like a set of artificial lungs. These were not temporary shelters. They were full-blown military bases, designed to launch, refuel, and repair warplanes without ever being seen from above. And their entire purpose was built around one core idea. The surface was lost. From the Nazi point of view, the ground could no longer be trusted. The skies belonged to the enemy. But the earth, the rock, the tunnels, the shadows, still offered protection. It was the last place war could survive, and they were determined to survive it. The strategy behind these underground airfields wasn't just about hiding. It was about timing. Imagine a jet sitting underground, fully fueled and armed. When a warning came in that Allied bombers were nearby, the elevator would lift the aircraft to the surface, often disguised as a farm track or clearing. The jet would take off quickly, intercept its target, and disappear again before enemy planes could respond. It was the ultimate ambush tactic, and the Messerschmitt. Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, was perfect for it. Its speed was unmatched at the time. No Allied bomber could outrun it. But the Me-262 had one problem. It was fragile. It needed special care, protected fueling systems, and a clean runway. Exposing it to weather or attack while it sat idle was dangerous. That's why these jets were often hidden underground, so they could survive long enough to fly. And when they flew, they were deadly. But they were never built in enough numbers to change the course of the war. Still, the infrastructure kept growing. The runways got longer, the tunnels got deeper, and somewhere along the way, the project stopped being about winning and started being about not disappearing. There's a strange irony here. The more the Nazis believed they were losing the war, the more effort they put into hiding. Hiding jets, hiding scientists, hiding documents, hiding leadership. In many ways, these underground airports were symbols of denial, of a regime trying to bury its collapse beneath concrete. But there's something darker, too. These places weren't just about protection. They were about resurrection. Many Nazi officials believed they could outlast the Allies, not by fighting harder, but by vanishing and waiting. Waiting for the world to forget, waiting for a new chance to rise. That's what made these underground facilities so dangerous. Not just what they held, but what they were meant to become. Survival bunkers for an ideology, shelters for ideas, not just planes. And the scale of construction was staggering. At one site in Kala, Thuringia, more than 15,000 prisoners were forced to build an underground aircraft factory codenamed LOX. They worked in brutal conditions, often starving, always watched by guards and beaten for slowing down. The tunnels stretched for miles. And what were they building there? Parts for jet engines, experimental fuselages. It was a ghost assembly line. Machines meant to fly, made by people never meant to leave. In Nordhausen, at the Mittelwerk facility, V-2 rockets were being built underground at horrifying human cost. Over 20,000 prisoners died constructing the site and assembling its deadly cargo. And just a few kilometers away, hangars were being built to house the jets meant to fly alongside those rockets. It was a vision of total underground war, missiles, jets, fuel, and silence. All beneath the surface. The Allies knew something was happening, but they didn't always know what. Air recon photos showed odd shadows. Infrared imaging caught unusual heat signatures near remote hills. But by the time troops arrived on foot, many of the sites had been abandoned or destroyed. Others were intact, but sealed, concrete doors blasted shut, entrances flooded, paperwork burned. What remained was often chilling: half-finished tunnels, rails that ended in the dark, wooden crates filled with spare jet parts, walls lined with chalk notes in German engineering code, and personal belongings of the forced laborers who had vanished without a trace. The deeper soldiers went, the more they realized. This war hadn't just been fought on the surface. A second war had been built beneath their boots. And it was just as real. One British officer, after entering a hidden hangar near Landsberg, reportedly said, "It's like they were building a second Germany, one that didn't need light or windows or even people." That line has stayed with historians ever since. Because that's what these underground airports truly were, a plan for survival without society. No civilians, no cities, just machines, fuel, weapons, steel. It was a version of the future so bleak, so mechanical, that even the Nazis couldn't make it work in time. But they tried. They tried with everything they had. and that tells us more than any battle ever could. Today, many of these underground airports have been forgotten, overgrown, flooded, collapsed. Some are sealed with concrete, others are being slowly uncovered by historians and researchers, but they still whisper. If you visit the woods outside Kalle, you'll find vents poking through mossy soil. At Landsberg, strange stone slabs lie in the forest like grave markers. In Austria, collapsed tunnel mouths still leak cold air. And in all of these places, you can feel it. That this war wasn't just about land or sky. It was also about silence, hidden things, and a world that almost existed, but didn't. The more you look at these underground airports, the more they start to feel like something out of science fiction, not just because of their size or secrecy, but because of what they represent. A war that kept trying to disappear from sight. A war that retreated under the ground as if trying to rewrite its ending. And in many ways, that's exactly what the Nazis were trying to do. After years of losing territory, cities, and lives, they stopped planning for victory and started preparing for survival. Not national survival, ideological survival. Survival of technology, of secrets, of systems that could one day rise again. These underground facilities weren't just about keeping planes hidden. They were about keeping ideas alive. What made them even more disturbing was that some weren't built near battle zones or supply lines. They were built in strange, remote places, far from the front, hard to access, and in some cases, impossible to explain. Engineers designed airports inside mountains, not near existing runways, but beneath tourist regions, old castles, and abandoned quarries. They weren't protecting active units. They were preparing fallback options, emergency nests, a place where, if everything else fell, they could still launch something. A new jet, a new weapon, a new plan. These weren't military decisions. They were emotional ones, born from desperation. And they speak volumes about the mindset of the Nazi high command in 1944 and 1945. By this point in the war, the Nazi military machine was crumbling. The Eastern Front had collapsed. Soviet tanks were moving west with terrifying speed. The Western Front had cracked too. Allied troops were pushing into Germany town by town. Major cities were reduced to rubble by bombings, and the skies were no longer contested. The Luftwaffe, once feared, had become almost irrelevant. So why keep building? Why pour concrete? Why dig deeper when there was barely enough fuel to keep trucks running? The answer is strange and haunting. Because many Nazi leaders believed the war wasn't truly over. They believed the Third Reich was just moving into a new phase. Underground warfare, psychological warfare, secret survival. In fact, Hitler had once told his inner circle that Germany would become a nation of bunkers and shadows, a cryptic phrase that later turned out to be more literal than anyone imagined. Entire industries were moved underground, blueprints were hidden, scientists were quietly relocated, and all across Central Europe these strange facilities began to appear. Half-finished tunnels, railways with no destinations, hangars with no runways. It was like watching a country try to bury itself alive in hopes that it might be reborn later. And if this sounds like paranoia, it wasn't only Nazi paranoia. After the war, Allied intelligence agencies were shocked by what they found underground. In some places, they uncovered prototypes of aircraft no one had ever seen before. Strange wings, unusual jet configurations, even early experiments with vertical takeoff. In others, they found documents hinting at post-war relocation strategies, coded plans for moving key personnel, technologies, and even families out of Germany into other countries. This wasn't just military defense. It was blueprinting for exile, for continuation. Some officers truly believed they could keep fighting from below. Not in the open, but in hidden ways. Through secret airfields, disguised cargo routes, false identities, silent networks. And the underground airports were at the center of it. Because even in exile, even in hiding, if you could launch a plane, you could still strike. You could still deliver. You could still matter. That's why so many of these underground sites were built with remarkable care. The walls weren't just tunnels. They were reinforced against shock waves. Some were curved to deflect blasts. Others had false chambers, empty rooms to confuse intruders. There were systems for hiding fuel drums under floors, for venting exhaust through fake wells, for moving entire aircraft from one end of a hill to the other using hidden rail tracks. One location even had a rotating launch platform, a turntable inside a mountain that could spin to align jets with multiple exits, all camouflaged. It was insane engineering. And what makes it more chilling is that the people building it didn't even know what they were building. Prisoners from concentration camps were brought in by the thousands, many starving, weak, beaten, and forced to carve into the rock. They weren't told why. They weren't told what it was for. They were just told to dig straight, dig wide, dig faster, and if they stopped, they disappeared. For many of them, these tunnels were both a job and a grave. And yet, in all this madness, there was method. The Nazi command knew that above ground they were being watched, but below ground they still had freedom. Freedom to test ideas, to delay surrender, to imagine the unthinkable. Some facilities had walls filled with empty blueprint frames, frames that once held plans, now missing. Others had ledgers with production codes that don't match known aircraft. Some even had buried safes, recovered decades later, or filled with documents no one could fully decode. And all of it leads to one conclusion. The underground airports were only one piece of something bigger, a larger survival system, one that might have gone even deeper than we realize. After the war ended, most of these places were destroyed. Some were bombed, others were flooded on purpose. In Soviet zones, many were stripped of machinery and sealed off with explosives. In the West, some were studied and then quietly forgotten. Governments didn't want the public asking too many questions. What was going on down there? What were we really close to discovering? The underground airports became a secret buried beneath other secrets. But explorers, historians, and survivors never fully let them go. In the decades since, dozens of these sites have been rediscovered. Some were turned into museums, others remain sealed, and a few are still being mapped today. Underground corridors that lead nowhere, or maybe somewhere no one wants to follow. But what they left behind isn't just concrete. It's a warning, a reminder of how war adapts, how fear reshapes reality, and how power, when cornered, doesn't always die. It hides, it waits, it digs deeper. These underground airports weren't just about aircraft, they were about belief. A belief that if you could control what was hidden, you could still control what was seen, even if it meant rewriting the rules of war itself. What's even more unsettling is what happened after the war, not during it. Because once the Allied forces discovered these underground airports, tunnel systems, and hidden runways, they didn't just shut them down. Many of them were taken over, studied, and in some cases, reused. In the early days of the Cold War, when the Iron Curtain was beginning to fall across Europe and tensions between the West and the Soviet Union were tightening like a vice, underground infrastructure became the new gold. Everyone wanted to know what the Nazis had built, not because they wanted to destroy it, but because they saw potential in it. Intelligence agents from the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union raced to map out every underground site they could find. Some were turned into military research bunkers. Others were used as listening posts, nuclear storage vaults, and even temporary command centers. It was as if both sides, now enemies, had inherited a playbook from a dying empire. And the underground airports were some of the most coveted assets in that inheritance. It wasn't about ideology anymore. It was about logistics, efficiency, survival. The Nazis had left behind a world beneath the surface, and now everyone else wanted to claim it. Take the example of the Jonas Valley in East Germany near the Thuringian Forest. During the Nazi era, this region was heavily fortified, riddled with secret tunnels, and rumored to be a testing site for advanced aircraft or possibly even atomic research. After the war, the Soviets moved in. And what did they do? They closed it off entirely. To this day, large portions of that area remain sealed, unexplored, unexcavated, and surrounded by mystery. Satellite images from the 1980s show strange mounds, unusually long ridges, and heat signatures that shouldn't exist in abandoned forest zones. Some historians believe the Soviets may have used these facilities for storing nuclear weapons. Others say it became a secret lab for aviation research, but nobody knows for sure. What's clear is that the Nazi underground systems didn't just vanish. They evolved, absorbed into the next great power struggle, a war that wasn't about tanks and trenches, but silence, secrets, and survival strategies written in concrete and steel. And this raises a deeper, more uncomfortable question. What if underground warfare wasn't just a Nazi idea? What if it was simply the beginning of a global trend? Because once the world saw what was possible, once they saw how entire airfields could be hidden, how jets could be launched from forests, how entire factories could operate out of mountains, they didn't forget. In the decades that followed, similar underground projects began to appear everywhere. The French built subterranean command bunkers. The British created underground radar shelters. The US built missile silos and aircraft hangars carved into Colorado rock. Even countries with no history of underground warfare began developing tunnel systems and hidden runways. Was it all inspired by the Nazis? Not entirely, but the Nazi example made one thing clear. You could build a war that wasn't visible, and that made it harder to fight, harder to win, and nearly impossible to end. What's even stranger is that many of these Nazi underground airports were never fully mapped. Some were abandoned halfway through, others were hidden so well that even local populations didn't know they existed. In one town in Lower Silesia, residents lived for decades above a hill that turned out to be hollow, packed with steel supports and concrete chambers never marked on any map. The discovery came in 2008, when a forest path collapsed during heavy rain, revealing an entrance. Inside, they found rusted railway tracks, old tools, and a staircase leading deeper into the earth. No one had touched it in 60 years, and no one knows what it was built for. Similar stories have appeared in the Czech Republic, Poland, and Austria, forgotten entrances found in basements, strange drafts coming from rock walls, sudden cave-ins revealing long corridors beneath villages. It's like Europe has ghosts underground, shadows of a war that still hasn't finished speaking. And then there's the question of the documents. Thousands of Nazi files were destroyed in the final weeks of the war, but not all of them. Allied intelligence recovered tons of paperwork, schematics, diagrams, production numbers, and encrypted notes. Some of those documents have been declassified, others remain sealed. Why? Some say it's to protect national security, that the designs even now reveal engineering secrets still relevant. Others suggest more chilling possibilities, that not everything underground was just for planes. Some tunnels held biological labs, some held chemical stores. A few may have even been part of early nuclear testing infrastructure. projects that were never finished but got further than anyone wants to admit. And that's where the mystery deepens. Because if underground airports were just about hiding jets, why did some have shielding strong enough to block radiation? Why did others have reinforced doors like those found in early nuclear sites? Why were some tunnel entrances lined with lead? These aren't signs of aircraft storage. These are signs of something far more dangerous. And yet, no one will confirm what those spaces were used for. Meanwhile, survivors, those who were forced to build these structures, carried the trauma long after the war. Many were prisoners of war, concentration camp victims, or enslaved civilians from occupied territories. After the war, they returned to broken homes, broken families, and unanswered questions. Some testified about what they saw underground. Others stayed silent, too afraid or too damaged to speak. And because many records were lost or destroyed, their memories became some of the only remaining sources. But memories fade. Testimonies are contested, and governments often avoid opening old wounds. So the deeper we dig into this underground world, the harder it is to know what's truth and what's rumor, what was planned, what was built, and what was imagined in panic and desperation. Still, every hidden hangar, every sealed tunnel, every forest that hums with cold air, they all say the same thing. Something was happening down there, and we still don't fully understand what. And maybe we never will. Maybe that's the point, because the Nazis didn't just build underground airports to fly jets. They built them to rewrite the rules of visibility, of conflict, of defeat. They wanted to vanish but traitorry. Putajdanin, not that does disappear. They wanted to fight, but not be seen. And in doing so, they left behind something more terrifying than a battlefield, a labyrinth, a secret war, a blueprint for how power can survive by going silent. The underground airports were never just military sites. They were mirrors. They reflect what happens when fear, ambition, and technology dig deep into the human mind, and then start digging into the earth. The deeper you go into these stories, the more you start to realize that the Nazis weren't just building structures. They were building time capsules, environments sealed from the outside world, loaded with equipment, supplies, fuel, schematics, and sometimes even escape plans. And the logic was terrifyingly clear. If the war couldn't be won above ground, maybe it could be paused below. Maybe if they built carefully enough, buried deeply enough, the Reich could disappear just long enough to survive its own collapse. This wasn't speculation. There were documented efforts in 1944 to convert entire underground airports into standby regimes. That is, political and military control centers with their own water supply, ventilation, backup communication systems, and power generators. Several of these sites were designed not just to launch aircraft, but to function independently for months, maybe years, without needing outside contact. Inside these spaces were officer quarters, mess halls, planning rooms, and even broadcast stations. The goal wasn't only to hide planes. It was to hide command, to retreat power into the bedrock. This is why, in places like the Wewelsburg region, Allied forces were baffled by how elaborate the subterranean complexes really were. They weren't military bases in the traditional sense. They were more like underground kingdoms, bunkered realms carved for leaders who knew the surface was no longer safe. These airports were only part of the puzzle. The real story was about control, silent, hidden, ready to reboot control, waiting in the earth for history to forget what had happened above. One of the most unsettling features of these complexes was their silence. Long after the war ended, explorers who stumbled upon these sealed places reported eerie stillness, stale air, frozen clocks, maps with pins still marking Allied advances, metal furniture arranged like someone had just stood up and left. In some rooms, uniforms were still folded on bunks. In others, half-finished blueprints lay beneath dust-covered glass. These weren't ruins. They were snapshots, moments of time locked behind steel doors. And it begs the question, who were these for? Some historians believe certain underground airports were intended for last stand squadrons, elite air units that would continue operating from below even if Germany was occupied. These pilots were trained to use secret airstrips disguised as roads or farmland, launch at night, intercept enemy aircraft, and vanish again before being tracked. It wasn't just theory. Several Allied airmen in 1945 reported being attacked by German jets that seemed to appear from nowhere, striking from forest clearings, only to vanish again minutes later. At first, these sightings were dismissed. But after the war, debriefings confirmed that underground lifts, camouflage hangars, and retractable shelters were operational in several regions, including Hesse, Bavaria, and Upper Austria. The Nazis had, in fact, turned the landscape into a weapon, a terrain of traps, a map of ghosts. And yet these constructions weren't just technical achievements, they were psychological weapons too. Imagine being an Allied soldier pushing into enemy territory, knowing that even if a village looks empty, there might be an entire air base under your feet. Imagine flying overhead, seeing no runway, no jets, no movement, and then losing a bomber to an enemy that shouldn't have been there. The fear of what was unseen became just as powerful as what was visible. And that's the genius and horror of the Nazi underground strategy. It turned absence into a kind of presence. Emptiness became a threat. That's why even today people talk about feeling something in the forests of Austria or the valleys of Thuringia, a pressure, a sense that something below hasn't quite died. Even if it's just concrete and rust now, the memory of what it was designed to do has weight. And it's that weight that modern researchers and historians continue to unpack. Take the case of Project Zement, an underground airport facility discovered decades after the war near St. Georgen an der Gusen in Austria. Local legends had spoken of strange activity in the hills, but no one could find anything concrete. Then, in the early 2000s, researchers uncovered massive reinforced walls hidden under layers of earth and forest. What they found was staggering. Tunnels over 75 meters long, shielded by granite, possibly used for jet fuel storage or weapons development. Some parts were so deeply buried they required ground-penetrating radar to even detect. Nearby, remnants of an airstrip were found that had been completely overgrown by time. No sign of jets, no markings. But the geometry matched Luftwaffe engineering standards from 1944. The layout made one thing clear: this wasn't a defensive position. It was an operational one. Planes went in, planes came out, but they didn't leave tracks. Not ones you could follow, not ones that lasted. And that was exactly the point. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of all of this is the unfinished work. Across Germany and Austria, there are dozens of sites where construction stopped suddenly, often in April or May of 1945. Equipment was left behind. Rail cars frozen mid-tunnel. Reinforcements only half poured. In one location, an underground hangar had clearly been prepared for painting. Scaffolding was still in place and ventilation systems were partially installed. But no jets ever came. It was as if someone called time right before the curtain could rise. Some historians believe these places were abandoned because of the sheer speed of the Allied advance. Others suspect something darker, that the sites were meant to be kept secret, even from Germany's own population. Maybe they weren't just about fighting. Maybe they were about vanishing, about creating places the world wasn't meant to find. Not yet. And if you zoom out far enough to see the whole pattern, you start to see something chilling. The underground airports weren't random. They formed a network, not perfectly connected, but strangely consistent. Similar designs, similar locations, similar intentions. It's as if someone had imagined a second Germany entirely below the first. A mirror country, shielded by dirt and stone, where aircraft could launch, leaders could hide, and war could continue even after surrender. The documents recovered in 1945 speak of strategic shadows, buried air corridors, and continuation platforms. These weren't metaphors. These were plans, drawn, approved, partially built, and never quite finished, or maybe never quite stopped. Today, when people visit these sites, the ones that are still accessible, they're often overcome by the contrast. Above ground, birds, forests, peaceful roads. Below ground, cold stone, rusted rails, and the scent of a history that was never supposed to be written. And yet, here we are, writing it, reading it, digging it up. These underground airports tell us more than just what the Nazis were building. They tell us what they were afraid of, what they were preparing for, and how far they were willing to go to make sure their war, their ideology, wouldn't end with the fall of Berlin. These weren't just bunkers. They were backup plans, fail-safes, echoes designed to outlive the shout. And that's why, even now, decades later, we keep going back. Not because we want to find jets, but because we want to understand the silence. But if you really want to understand why the Nazis kept building underground airports, you have to step out of military logic and into psychological warfare, not against enemies, but against time. These bunkers weren't just reactions to air raids or desperation in the late war years. They were part of a belief system, a deep, twisted conviction that the Third Reich wasn't meant to end in 1945. Hitler and his top command didn't just think they were fighting a war. They believed they were building a legacy, a Reich that would last 1,000 years, and if that future couldn't unfold above ground, then it would wait below. This is why you'll find airports buried in granite, runways carved into cave floors, control towers hidden in vertical shafts that descend deep into the Alps. These were not temporary shelters. They were meant to endure, to survive collapse, to serve as seeds, capsules of military power, ideology, and engineering that could one day grow again. Think about that. They weren't just hiding planes. They were hiding futures. And that idea, that underground airfields could become the last chapters of a fallen empire, is what makes them so eerie to study now. Because some of them still exist. They weren't destroyed. They weren't exposed. They simply faded back into the hills, waiting in silence, still intact. And here's where it gets even more complex. This wasn't just Nazi thinking. Underground warfare, especially involving aviation, had been imagined by multiple powers even before World War II. But the Nazis took it to an entirely new level. They fused it with ideology. They believed that by building beneath the surface, they were making something unkillable. You could bomb Berlin, you could level Dresden, but you couldn't erase what you couldn't reach. Hitler often spoke of the Eternal Reich, and in many ways these buried airports were his attempt to make that metaphor physical. Concrete that didn't decay. Steel doors that would never open without a password. Rail systems sealed off from time. Some facilities were even designed with future reactivation in mind. Coded signs, color-coded pipes, vaults with instructions written in cryptic technical terms, as if the builders knew that years or decades later, someone might try to finish what had been started. These weren't just exits from defeat. They were entries into myth. Now pause and imagine this. It's 1945. The Reich is collapsing. Soviet and American forces are closing in. Cities are burning. And yet, deep beneath a hill in central Germany, a team of engineers is still pouring concrete, wiring generators, and fitting steel doors to an underground hangar no Allied plane will ever bomb. Why? Why continue when everything above is falling apart? The answer might be more disturbing than strategic. Because, for the architects of the Third Reich, defeat was never fully accepted. It was delayed, outsourced, buried. These bunkers, these airports, these tunnel systems weren't built to win. They were built to outwait, to be activated later, maybe in 5 years, maybe in 50. It wasn't just survival. It was resurrection, the hope that somewhere, sometime, someone would find the keys. And that's why, long after the war ended, Allied investigators kept finding sealed doors that led nowhere. Or maybe somewhere, just not yet. One such case is in the Harz Mountains, a site known only by its code name, Malachite. Discovered in fragments by British soldiers in late 1945, this was believed to be part of a vast underground transport hub connected to nearby airstrips. But here's what made it terrifying. The entrances had been booby-trapped, not with mines, but with collapsible tunnels. Once you entered a wrong shaft, the ceiling gave way. This wasn't to kill, it was to protect what lay beyond. Allied engineers eventually found sections that had been deliberately flooded, others lined with ceramic insulation, not typical for bunkers, but perfect for storing fuel, or maybe experimental aircraft. To this day, parts of Malachite have never been excavated. The cost is too high, the risk too great. The blueprint was there, but the meaning remains unclear. Was it an airport, a testing site, a vault, or a decoy? That's the thing with the Nazi underground. Every door could be real or a dead end. Every map could be a clue or a distraction. Meanwhile, the legacy of these underground airports continued to shape military strategy long after Hitler was gone. The Americans and Soviets didn't just inherit the ruins. They studied them, copied them. In Nevada, Utah, and New Mexico, U.S. military bases began experimenting with underground hangars and aircraft elevators. In Russia, the concept evolved into hardened missile silos and subterranean drone testing labs. In Switzerland, an entire mountain was turned into an aircraft hangar system with retractable blast doors hidden by natural rock. Even China has reportedly built underground airfields in remote regions where runways lead straight into cliff faces. Impossible to spot unless you're directly above them. This is not accidental. This is inheritance, a global echo of a war strategy born in the shadows of Nazi Germany. And it all started with a simple idea. You can't bomb what you can't find. Of course, there's a darker side too. In recent years, conspiracy theories have surrounded many of these sites. Some claim that Nazi leaders escaped through underground corridors to secret bases in South America. Others believe there are still sealed vaults containing documents, gold, even weapons, deep within the Alps or beneath former German airfields. And while most of these stories have no evidence, the mystery remains. Because for every known tunnel, every mapped facility, there are dozens more we still don't fully understand. What's more unsettling is that some of the most powerful underground facilities, like the Mühldorf bunker or the Gusen complex, were located so deep in forest or mountain that their scale wasn't even fully grasped until satellite imagery arrived decades later. That's how effective the strategy was. A war that disappeared in real time and has stayed hidden in memory. And maybe that's the real answer to the question, why did the Nazis keep building underground airports? Because it wasn't just about strategy, it was about legacy, about planting the seeds of a future Reich beneath the wreckage of the present one. These weren't airports. They were ideas, cast in concrete, buried in silence, and aimed at eternity. And even now, when we walk the hills and forests of Europe, when we stumble across sealed doors, rusted rails, and cracks in the earth that breathe cold air, we're not just looking at ruins. We're looking at plans, unfinished, unspoken, unforgotten. But not every tunnel led to mystery. Some led to misery, and when we talk about Nazi underground airports, we can't ignore the human cost. These were not just architectural feats or engineering puzzles. They were built on forced labor. Thousands of prisoners, political enemies, resistance members, Jews, Roma, POWs were forced to dig, pour concrete, lay rails, and die underground. It wasn't just soldiers or contractors doing the work. It was slave labor, the hidden fuel of these invisible fortresses. Take the Weingut Eye complex near Mühldorf. Designed as a massive underground hangar for jet production, it was excavated and constructed by inmates from Dachau's satellite camps. These were men already half-starved, pulled from overcrowded barracks and marched under guard into the belly of the earth each day with barely any tools. They used picks, shovels, wheelbarrows, sometimes even their bare hands. The air inside was damp, foul, and full of dust. There was no proper lighting, no ventilation. Cave-ins were frequent. So were beatings. Some prisoners were forced to sleep inside the very tunnels they were building, alongside machinery, rubble, and death. And yet the work continued, because to the Nazi command, these men weren't laborers. They were fuel, disposable, replaceable, invisible, just like the structures they were building. And it didn't stop at Mühldorf. Across Austria and Germany, wherever you find these hidden airfields or sealed bunkers, you find the same story written in pain. Camps nearby, barbed wire, watchtowers, shallow graves. The Gusen 3 subcamp was created solely to feed the Bergkristall tunnel system, where Messerschmitt jets were being secretly assembled in underground factories. This wasn't just a war effort, it was a death machine. And the irony is brutal. Some of the most advanced aviation technology of the war, the Me-262 jet fighter, was being built by men who would never see the sky again. The contrast is sickening. Above, sleek aircraft, secret runways, high command. Below, corpses, coughing, silent rebellion. The Nazis called this total war. But what it really was total disregard for life. The jet needed a tunnel, the tunnel needed a graveyard, and so they built both, one beneath the other. Even today, when historians explore these sites, they find tools made from bone, scratched messages in concrete, toothbrushes buried in wall crevices. These weren't just prisoners. They were witnesses, trying, in small, desperate ways, to leave a mark. Something to say. I was here. I saw this. I died for this madness. And it's those marks, faint, hidden, human, that often outlast the steel and stone. It's easy now to look at these underground airports as marvels of military paranoia, to be fascinated by the secrecy, to study the engineering blueprints. But if we forget who bled to make them real, we're not telling the full story. For every mile of tunnel, there was a trail of broken backs. For every steel hangar door, there was a coffin with no name. The underground war wasn't clean. It wasn't cold. It was soaked in suffering. And yet the Nazis were proud of it. They documented it, photographed it, even bragged about it in coded communications. To them, building deep beneath the soil was not just clever. It was destiny. A symbol of permanence, of rebirth, of Reich beyond ruin. And that is what makes it so important to return, not just as tourists of darkness, but as historians of conscience. To stand in these places and hear what is no longer spoken, the boots, the echoes, the breath of the buried. Some survivors did make it out. Years later, they spoke. In memoirs, interviews, courtrooms, they described what it felt like to march into a tunnel at 4 a.m., carrying 50 pounds of gear, only to emerge 12 hours later into the same gray mist, colder, weaker, more forgotten. They spoke of beatings for spilling cement, of death from falling ceiling slabs, of whispers passed between prisoners, about revolts that never came, and about planes that no one would ever see. They remembered how some guards were cruel, and others strangely quiet, as if even they knew this was not war, but something else, something uglier. There's one account of a prisoner at Ebensee who described hearing jet engines for the first time echoing through the tunnel he helped dig, a sound so alien and powerful that for a moment it felt like the mountain itself had come alive. And then he realized this wasn't progress. It was panic. The sound of a regime trying to claw its way back from the grave. And still, the jets launched. Not many, but enough. In early 1945, as Berlin burned and the Western Front surged forward, Luftwaffe squadrons emerged from forest clearings and hidden bunkers to fire desperate bursts at Allied bombers. Some planes bore no insignia, just gray paint, black shadows, and terrifying speed. They would rise, attack, vanish. No radio, no trail, just silence. Some believed they came from myth. Others knew the truth. They came from underground. From the factories no one could bomb. The runways no one could see. The airports built not to be found, but to survive. That was the end game. Not to win, but to disappear, to haunt. So when we talk about the Nazi underground airports, their scope, their terror, their scale, we must remember they were more than concrete. They were ambition, they were madness, and they were tombs. Tombs for an ideology, tombs for a generation, tombs for the people who were forced to build them and the people who believed they'd rise again. Because if there's anything the earth keeps better than secrets, it's scars. And these places, these tunnels, these runways, these echo chambers, are scars written in stone. They remind us that war is not just what happens above. Sometimes the deepest violence runs right beneath our feet, quiet, hidden, and still waiting to be fully understood. But what makes this story even stranger is what happened after the war. The bunkers didn't just vanish. The tunnels didn't collapse overnight. The war ended, but these underground airports remained, buried, sealed, often forgotten, or deliberately ignored. And that raises an uncomfortable question. Who took over what the Nazis left behind? In 1945, when Allied forces overran former German territory, they discovered dozens of incomplete underground projects, many so well concealed that only captured documents or defecting engineers revealed their existence. American forces uncovered massive airfield systems under construction near the Bavarian forest. The Soviets stumbled upon hidden hangars beneath former salt mines. The British found bunkers with aircraft parts scattered near sealed vertical shafts. Some were half-built, some were untouched, some were just rumors. Heard in a bar, whispered in interrogation, never fully confirmed. And yet, every power wanted to know more. So instead of demolishing them, they mapped them, studied them. Some were sealed with explosives, yes, but others were preserved, archived, in certain cases, quietly repurposed. Because even after defeating the Nazi regime, the underground world it had built was just too advanced, too intriguing, and too hard to replicate from scratch. Why pour billions into designing a secret base when one already existed, hidden, hardened, and deep in the mountains? Take the case of Project Quarz near Langenstein-Zweiberge in the Harz Mountains. It was a sprawling underground complex, part jet factory, part command center, part mystery. The Americans entered the site just as the war ended, but the Soviets arrived shortly after and quickly claimed control. For years, no one knew what had become of it. Then, decades later, declassified documents suggested that the Soviets had quietly used the site for weapons testing. No official admission, just faint satellite traces, disturbed soil patterns, and retired officers who nodded but never spoke. Other bunkers, like those beneath Nordhausen or the Berghof region, were partially destroyed, but only after engineers had photographed every inch. And in some very rare cases, the Allies even continued construction. Not to launch Nazi jets, of course, but to explore the feasibility of similar facilities for their own Cold War purposes. This wasn't theft, this was strategy. If the enemy spent millions carving cathedrals underground, it would be foolish not to at least walk through the ruins and see what made them so determined. And this brings us to an eerie modern reality. Some of the world's most secret military facilities today mirror what the Nazis were building then. Underground hangars are now standard at certain high-security air bases in countries like Israel, Switzerland, Iran, China, and North Korea. The US itself maintains multiple hardened aircraft shelters buried in rock, complete with automated blast doors, fuel tunnels, and retractable runways. These aren't Nazi copies exactly, but the logic is the same: survival. In an age of drones, satellites, and precision bombing, surface bases are vulnerable. But underground, you can vanish again, just like 1945. The question isn't whether the underground airport died with the Reich. The question is how much of it simply changed flags. The silence that once echoed through abandoned Nazi tunnels, that cold breath of concrete and waiting, now lives on in modern bunkers, built by new hands but haunted by old ideas. Of course, there are places still untouched. In Germany and Austria today, there are entire tunnel systems sealed since 1945, places too dangerous, too fragile, or too politically sensitive to open. Some lie beneath forests with only rusted vents poking out of the moss. Others are below housing developments, their entrances bricked over by post-war authorities. In some towns, locals still tell stories about strange vibrations beneath the ground, old pipes that lead nowhere, or thick fog that emerges from cracks during the winter. Urban legends? Maybe. But consider this. Even in the last 10 years, amateur explorers and demolition crews have uncovered new shafts. Tunnels once thought destroyed, still intact behind fake walls. In 2018, a construction project near Linz accidentally broke into an old Nazi corridor, complete with signage, rusted tracks, and sealed doors. No records, no maps, just a forgotten hole in the earth leading down into silence. And when officials arrived to inspect, they quietly resealed it, citing safety concerns. No press releases, no further questions, and that's the problem, isn't it? These places aren't just hard to find. They're hard to face, because they challenge the story we like to tell ourselves, that the war ended, the evil was defeated, and nothing of its machinery remains. But these bunkers, these airfields, these airports of ash and ambition, they are still here. Not because of ghosts, not because of conspiracy, but because concrete doesn't care about politics. Steel doesn't obey ideology. What was built to last, lasts, even now. And if you listen closely, in the right forest, in the right valley, near the right hill, you might still hear the wind rustling over a sealed runway, or feel the ground faintly hum beneath your feet. Not from jets, not from machines, but from memory. Memory that refuses to be buried. So why did the Nazis keep building underground airports? Maybe because they feared defeat. Maybe because they believed in a return. Maybe because they wanted to outlive history itself. But no matter the reason, their legacy still lingers. In diagrams, in scars, in locked doors that haven't been opened in 80 years. And as we walk forward into a world of newer wars, quieter bombs, and digital skies, we might do well to remember the deepest battles are often the ones no one sees. They aren't fought in headlines. They're fought in tunnels, in chambers, in the quiet hum of a hangar that no longer opens, but once did, and maybe will again. But not every underground airport was meant for jets. Some were meant for something stranger, things that never made it to the battlefield but still haunt history books and engineering archives today. Toward the end of the war, with defeat closing in from all sides, Nazi leadership began pouring resources into what they called Wunderwaffe, wonder weapons, experimental aircraft, new fuels, vertical takeoff systems, soundless gliders, aircraft that didn't just rise, they lifted straight up, spun mid-air, and vanished from radar. These weren't conspiracy theories. They were blueprints. Some even made it to prototype. And the only place such delicate, risky experiments could be hidden from Allied bombing: underground. Beneath mountains, forests, hills, in sealed chambers with test rigs and iron rails for acceleration. Places like the Jonastal tunnels in Thuringia, where work crews toiled day and night in secrecy while rumors spread of an X-plane being assembled there. Or the underground facilities near Melk, where witnesses claimed to have seen disc-shaped structures on carts covered in tarps, being wheeled into deep shafts under guard. Were these real flying saucers? Probably not. But were they unconventional aircraft the Nazis hoped would turn the tide of war? Absolutely. The desperation was real. And so was the technology. Documents recovered after the war included turbine concepts that had no wings, only fans, designs that spun like gyroscopes, engines with no visible exhaust, things far too advanced for 1945, but maybe just right for a Reich that wanted to cheat time. And it didn't stop with aircraft. Some underground airports weren't for launching planes at all. They were for hiding them. Entire squadrons. In 1945, Allied forces approaching the Austrian Alps discovered massive vertical elevator shafts inside mountains that led to multi-level aircraft storage bunkers. The planes weren't just hidden, they were stacked like archives. Some elevators could lift a fully fueled fighter from underground to mountaintop in under 90 seconds. It wasn't fantasy, it was physics. Mechanics were trained to maintain engines underground. Aircraft were fueled inside tunnels with retractable hoses that ran through ceiling ducts. Runways were hidden behind collapsible camouflage. From the air, it looked like a field. From the ground, it looked like a tree line. But one button would open steel doors that had been painted to match the rocks and let out a jet, already hot and ready to fly. And just like that, it would vanish again. This was warfare built on illusion, not defense, not offense, just vanishing, a war of shadows, of silence, of waiting. It makes you wonder how many times, during the final weeks of the war, Allied planes flew over empty valleys, never realizing that death sat 30 meters below, waiting for a chance to rise again. One of the strangest such discoveries came near the town of Kalle in Germany. Beneath the Walpersberg Hill, engineers uncovered an immense network of galleries designed not only to build aircraft, but to allow them to be assembled in vertical positions, nose up, tail down. Why? No one is entirely sure. Some believe the design allowed jet engines to be inserted from above more easily. Others suggest these chambers were meant for experimental vertical liftoff prototypes. Whatever the case, the design was unlike anything seen before or since. It was as if gravity itself had been redesigned. When American forces entered the complex, they found intact parts, engines, notes, and dozens of corpses of forced laborers who had been sealed inside by retreating SS troops. The message was chilling. If we can't finish this future, no one will. But they underestimated history, because those corpses spoke louder than any jet. Their bones told the truth. That underground airports weren't just about innovation. They were about madness. Genius twisted by fear, vision blinded by hatred. And still, questions remain. To this day, researchers and amateur historians debate how many of these underground airports actually became operational. Some insist only a handful were truly used for launching aircraft. Others believe dozens were activated in the last chaotic weeks of the war, but without reliable records, we may never know. What we do know is that the Allies took these places seriously, very seriously. British intelligence in 1944 ran dozens of aerial recon missions specifically to spot unusual terrain deformations that might indicate hidden airfields. U.S. bomber crews were instructed to prioritize suspicious geological voids, a phrase that sounds absurd until you realize they meant literal holes in the ground big enough to house fleets. The Soviets, too, were obsessed. After the war, they devoted entire military units to exploring and mapping former Nazi underground structures, not just for history, but to look for hidden tech, missing scientists, and anything that could hint at what the Third Reich was preparing to unleash. And here's the strangest part. After nearly 80 years, we still don't know where they all are. Some maps were destroyed, others were falsified. A few have only recently resurfaced in family attics or forgotten archives. Even now, new locations are being uncovered by accident. In 2015, a Polish couple digging near a forest stumbled upon reinforced concrete buried beneath ivy. What they thought was an old warehouse turned out to be the roof of a tunnel system that had never been documented. Local officials cordoned it off, sent in geologists, and found signs of sealed shafts extending hundreds of meters, complete with rail grooves, ventilation, and blast doors. Where did it lead? No one knows. It remains sealed. Why? Officially, safety. Unofficially, too many questions, because once you open one of these doors, it's not just rust and stone that you find. You find plans, secrets, things built in the dark that still haven't come fully into the light. And maybe that's the scariest part, because it makes you wonder, what were they really preparing for? A last stand, a future war, or something even more chilling, a Reich that could live without land, without cities, just bunkered, buried, breathing underground, waiting for history to forget, then return. And that's why these airports still matter. Not because of what they launched, but because of what they almost launched. Not because of what flew out of them, but what they were willing to die building, in the hope it might fly someday. And maybe that's the darkest kind of war, the one you don't lose by being defeated, but by being remembered. There's something eerie about war you can't see, something that lingers longer than the smoke and the sirens. And when you think about the Nazi obsession with building underground airports, you start to realize it wasn't just about hiding. It was about rewriting reality, a world where war didn't make noise, didn't leave craters, didn't show up on photographs or maps, a war that lived in the silence under your feet. That's what makes this part of history so haunting. It's not just what the Nazis were building, it's how they were building it. Not above, not beside, but beneath. Beneath towns, beneath forests, beneath mountains. In rooms you couldn't bomb because you didn't know they were there. In tunnels so deep that even time had trouble reaching them. The deeper you dig into these stories, literally and metaphorically, the more you realize that the underground airport was not just a physical space. It was a philosophy, a belief that you could win a war not by being stronger, but by being unseen, that you could erase your weakness by hiding it, that you could outlive your enemies by becoming invisible. But here's the truth. You can bury the structure, but you can't bury the intent. And maybe that's what makes these places feel so heavy, even now. You walk through a mossy forest, birds chirping, a breeze moving gently through the leaves, and suddenly your foot hits metal, a vent, a rusted panel, a concrete edge hidden in the brush. And you remember, someone once designed this place to outlast bombs, to keep secrets safe while the world burned above. And now it just sits there, half swallowed by nature, half preserved by silence. There are stories of hikers stumbling into hollowed hills, of children finding doors that don't open, of dogs barking at trees that echo. And slowly, the picture begins to form. A landscape haunted not by ghosts, but by ambition. By the things humans can build when they stop caring about who pays the price. Because every one of these airports, tunnels, and hidden chambers had a price. Not just in concrete, not just in marks and Reichsmarks, but in lives, in hands that bled, in lungs that filled with dust, in mothers who never saw their sons again because they vanished into a mountain to pour concrete for a plane that never flew. So why does it matter now? Why tell this story again? Because the world is once again building underground, not always for war, but sometimes. Missile silos, drone shelters, deep command bunkers, cities with airports beneath shopping malls. Some of it is defensive, some of it is practical, but the mindset, the idea that safety equals invisibility, is spreading again. And history whispers a warning. The last time this idea took hold, the result wasn't peace. It was terror wrapped in stone. These bunkers, these buried airports, they aren't just reminders of the past. They are prototypes, lessons in what happens when technology and fear shake hands in the dark. When you don't plan for peace, but for silence. And silence, as we've seen, can be far more dangerous than noise, especially when it's engineered. There's also the matter of memory, because so many of these places were designed to be forgotten. Not in a romantic way, not like ancient ruins, but in a calculated, strategic way. No signs, no plaques, just disappearance. A war that tried to erase itself while it was still being fought. It's chilling when you think about it. Most wars leave too many scars. This one tried to leave none, or at least none that could be seen from above. And that's why we dig, not just with shovels, but with questions, with cameras, with stories, with witnesses who still remember a brother who vanished, a mother who whispered he never came home from the tunnel, a town that built over a secret and called it progress. But every now and then, someone finds a page, a blueprint, a sealed hatch in a hotel basement, and for a moment, the silence breaks. There's also the mystery we can't ignore. Why so many? We know some of the reasons: bombing, secrecy, desperation, but the scale still baffles experts. Why invest so much into infrastructure that could barely be finished in time? Why build hangars that never housed planes? Why create a network of sealed tunnels that seem to go nowhere? Some historians believe the Nazi high command was planning for a long underground war, a Fourth Reich scenario, where leadership would hide beneath the Alps and wait for a future resurgence. Others believe these airfields were meant to store weapons that still haven't been found. Chemical, biological, experimental. There are even credible documents suggesting underground chambers designed specifically for aircraft with nuclear payload potential, a concept barely graspable in 1944, but fully feared. Whether these theories are true or not is beside the point. The fact that they are plausible is what makes this history matter. Because when ambition meets secrecy and war meets science fiction, you don't just get ruins, you get riddles. And still, the riddle grows. In 2021, a group of researchers using ground-penetrating radar near the Austrian-German border detected a grid of anomalies beneath a wooded ridge. The pattern suggested symmetrical structures, roughly 12 meters wide, spaced exactly 24 meters apart, running over 300 meters. No surface markers, no documentation, just a digital ghost beneath the ground. When asked if it could be an underground runway, the lead researcher shrugged and said, "We don't know what else it could be." Authorities blocked excavation. The forest remains quiet, but the radar images still circulate, and with them, the question, how many airports are still down there, waiting? Maybe that's the legacy, not the jets, not the runways, not even the bunkers, but the questions, the holes in our maps, the doors that don't open. Because when you bury something deeply enough, not just in soil, but in silence, it becomes more than a structure. It becomes a myth, a puzzle, a caution sign to future generations. And this story, it's not just about the Nazis, it's about us. What we build when we're afraid, what we hide when we're losing, and what we leave behind when we think no one will ever come looking. So here we are, at the end of the tunnel, quite literally. We've wandered through blueprints that never saw sunlight, into airfields that had no sky, and through ideas that never fully took flight. But they didn't vanish. They were buried, locked behind steel and myth. And now we, decades later, are the ones holding the flashlight. So let's pause, just for a second, and ask again, why did the Nazis keep building underground airports? Why pour concrete into caves? Why carve hangars into cliffs and hills? The answer isn't simple, but it's clear enough once you've seen the scale. They weren't just trying to fly, they were trying to survive, trying to disappear, trying to build a version of war that couldn't be interrupted, one that could restart if needed. These underground spaces were not signs of power. They were symptoms of paranoia. The Reich was crumbling, and beneath the earth they tried to freeze time. What they built wasn't just infrastructure, it was denial, a refusal to accept that the war above was lost. So they went below, as if history couldn't follow them there. And yet, it did. Because time eventually cracks concrete, water finds seams, and memory seeps in. That's why these places, even the ones no one visits, still matter. Because they are physical remains of a mindset we can't afford to forget. They show us what happens when a regime stops planning for victory and starts planning for survival without light. They show us the cost of obsession, not in bombs dropped, but in hands crushed, lungs filled with dust, lives erased inside sealed tunnels that now echo with nothing but silence. If you've ever walked past a forest and heard nothing but birdsong, remember, someone once tried to put an airport beneath those trees. If you've ever driven past a mountain and admired the view, understand, beneath that stone may still be an elevator shaft built to launch jets no one remembers. That's the true ghost of this story. Not spirits, but systems. Not the people, but the possibility that what was built to vanish nearly succeeded. We often talk about ruins as tragic, as beautiful, but these are not the kind of ruins you frame in a travel guide. These are hidden, on purpose. These were never built to be admired. They were built to be forgotten, kauti, because they held something no one wanted to remember. The end game of a government that was willing to bury its future and its people in exchange for one more day of control. When we visit these sites, the ones we're allowed to, they feel cold, industrial, stripped of emotion. But the real weight is in the absence. The question that lingers in the dust. What else is down there? Maybe it's just concrete. Maybe it's just silence. Or maybe it's the truth. That the war didn't just end. It went underground. And maybe parts of it never fully came back up. And as the years pass, these places become harder to find. Trees grow, doors rust, witnesses pass away, and the idea of an underground airport begins to sound more like science fiction than fact. But here's the twist. It was all real. Every tunnel, every air shaft, every forgotten base. And even now, historians, explorers, and researchers are still uncovering new sections of it, mile by mile, file by file, brick by brick. It's not about conspiracy, it's about legacy. What we build, and what we bury, what we choose to remember, and what we let sleep in the dark. So the next time you're walking through a quiet valley or staring at a mountain or driving past a forest at dusk and you feel that strange stillness, the kind that makes the air a little heavier, maybe listen a little closer, not for footsteps, not for engines, but for the quiet hum of unfinished history, for the war beneath the war, for the airport no one ever landed at, but someone, somewhere, planned to launch from. That's where our story ends. Or maybe where it just begins again. Now, where are you watching from? What time is it for you right now? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more slow, quiet, truthful journeys through the corners of world history that textbooks often skip, subscribe. We're just getting started.